Hi, I am Jeffrey Warnick, and I'm very pleased to have Raul Livas as someone who we will be having a conversation with today. Raul and I have known each other for over 20 years now. Um, Raul has been quite a successful career in Mexico, in both academically and professionally. Raul studied at the prestigious university ITAM and studied economics, and Raul won an award from a prize for Banamex gives to the best dissertation. Raul then finished up in ITAM and went to study in the United States and got a Ph.D. in economics from MIT. Um, he also won another award from Banamex for his dissertation associated with his PhD. So he's a two-time winner of the Banamex award. And then Raul has subsequently done work in both the private sector and the public sector. In the private sector, he's had quite a few years where he worked in a senior executive position at Pemex, which is a state-owned oil company, basically the company that funds Mexico, and to a great extent. He also worked at a brokerage house. He headed up the research division there of a brokerage house, an investment banking house that was run by the former finance minister of Mexico, Pedro Aspe. And Raul has also worked closely with Jesus Reyes Arolas, which is part of a royalty in Mexico as far as a political family. Jesus's father was once one of the most senior people in government, and probably at some point in time one of the top 5 most powerful people in Mexico, who left government with an excellent reputation, as did Jesus. Jesus has actually served as Mexican's ambassador to the United States, as well as he running Pemex. He ran Banobras, which is an infrastructure bank. He ran an economic consulting firm called GEA. He created, along with Raul Jesus, a company called Structura, and I guess it's Energia. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But Jesus has had quite a prolific career, and Raul has worked for the best and brightest in Mexico. I don't recall if you also worked with Paco Gil. Did you do anything?
No, I never worked with Paco, but I worked with Luis Telles and with Adriana Yus. Those were all my bosses in my career in government.
So during a period of time in which Mexico and Mexicans were very excited about a period of time of real structural reform in the country, a structural reform that took a country that was a poor country, and now it's a middle income country. And during that period of time, Raul has done work, as I said, in the public and private sector, and has had quite a distinguished career. And he continues also to teach. He teaches economic growth theory. So I'm really happy to have Raul as my guest, and I think what will be relevant, given the outcome of the election yesterday, is really to talk about what speculation regarding the U.S.-Mexican relationship. My sense has been is that there's always been, as usually is the case when you have a foreign policy based upon bullying, which I think is what the U.S. foreign policy is usually predicated upon, is bullying, is that there's an asymmetry in the sense that various presidents, including Trump, have said that Mexico is killing Americans through aiding and abetting the exportation of fentanyl from Mexico to the United States, and also has accused Mexico of actually being complicit in not only allowing the illegal immigration, but promoting illegal immigration. I guess there's been statements made that basically Mexico seems to have a strategy going into the prisons, choosing the worst population, and financing their trips to the United States. And so that Mexico is basically using is basically choosing the worst in Mexico and subsidizing their travels to the United States. So they're going into the prisons, they're going to the wardens and saying, "To me the worst," so we'll write them checks, and we'll send them to the United States. And basically, they're doing the same with all the mental health institutions. Is that they're going and they're sending, I guess there probably might not be any mental health facility in Mexico, because I guess the strategy of Mexico, the government has been, instead of paying for people's health care, is buying them tickets to get them, to the cartels and giving them, financing their trips into the United States. And if they get deported, Mexico will finance their trip back to the United States. But that this has not been an organic policy. It's actually been a policy of the Mexican government, financed and directed by the Mexican government. That's basically been the accusations. So apparently it's Mexico's responsibility to keep fentanyl out of the United States. It's Mexico's responsibility to keep drugs out of the United States. It's Mexico's responsibility to keep Mexicans out of the United States. And it's Mexico's responsibility to keep anyone that flows through Mexico from other parts of the world into the United States. That's all Mexicans' responsibility. But apparently the U.S. has no responsibility for the fact that it basically is responsible for arming the cartels. And the cartels are killing a lot of people. And all the weapons that are exported from the United States into Mexico, which are illegal in Mexico, as illegal as the drugs are in the United States, the weapons coming into Mexico are also illegal in Mexico. And apparently the United States government bears no responsibility for keeping weapons out of Mexico. So, so from, I'd like to have people appreciate a Mexican perspective on these problems. And also Trump recently announced that if he's not satisfied with Mexico's performance with respect to how Mexico deals with keeping fentanyl out, keeping Mexicans out, and keeping drugs out, that he will penalize Mexico by imposing 25% across the board tariffs. And if Mexico still doesn't perform adequately, he'll raise it to 50% and then 100%, irrespective of the fact that he himself negotiated a free trade agreement with Mexico that doesn't allow him to do that. So, but I guess the U.S. keeping treaties or we only keep them when they're convenient for us to keep them. Maybe that's the point. So, Raul, as you hear the rhetoric, if you were back in the Mexican government and you were sitting in a cabinet level and you were discussing this, or at least some of the people that how would they be how do you think like a Jesus would be responding to these type of bullying tactics and threats that the U.S. places upon? I'm not going to say uniquely Trump, because it's not been uniquely Trump, these type of threats. But what would you think about it? How would you deal with it? How do you think Mexican society reacts to this?
Well, you tossed me a lot of questions in the first, so let me start taking them one by one. And let me start with a joke that's attributed to President Diaz Ordaz. And there was this reporter that went with Diaz Ordaz and told him, "What do you think?" So this is an old problem. Diaz Ordaz was president from 1964 to 1970. And they asked him, what do you think that Mexico is becoming a great trampoline to bring drugs into the United States? And his answer was, well, if you have a big pool, you need a big trampoline. So it's essentially our problem is that this is a combination where drug consumption was an elite thing in the past. And there was demand for lighter drugs in those years. It was mostly marijuana, cannabis, and that type of drug, and that created side business for peasants. And it was somewhat of a now all of these things are legal, at least in many of the states in the United States. and given that they are legal, it's having increases in productivity. So in the end, we're going to be importing cannabis from the United States as the way things are moving now. So on the drugs, it's a long problem. Now I can't say we are not consuming because it's been so many years of the flow of drugs and the change in technology. And now, before it was somewhat fun to have these light drugs, but now that you have fentanyl and other harder drugs, it's taking a big toll of people in the United States, and that has changed the relevance of the problem in the United States. So now we will see a lot of pressure to take care of the consumption, at least of these hard drugs.
Sorry.
You can't get no satisfaction.
Well, the story of my life.
So on the drug thing, at least now we're going to have to work hand in hand on that issue, and it has been a problem that it started there, and the old drug lords wanted to keep themselves to have that market and didn't do much outside of it. But some 20 years ago, it started overflowing into different things. And given with the democratization of the country that had an important milestone in 2000, that changed the way the illegal drug gangs related to the government, because the government became more decentralized in terms of power, and the way to deal with these things became more also decentralized. And then you have the penetration of the drug cartels into different parts of the government and into different businesses. So the extortion and other types of problems began to surface. And now it's an unmanageable situation in many regions of the country. No, and what happens with that? And probably the state of Tamaulipas it's an interesting case, because the problem with the drug lords got so bad there that I would say that probably more than half of the Tamaulipas elite families now live in Texas. No, they moved there and they left their homes and they started to move to more modest places here in Mexico, to whoever wants to keep running their businesses. Those that were able to sell them, sold them, and you have a very difficult situation. The same is happening in Guerrero. Now we have a terrible drug war or drug gang related war in Chiapas, where it's part of the consequence of the previous Trump administration, where Trump said, okay, guys, you have to stop migration, and that created a different style of control of border crossings in the southern border, and it has become somewhat of a nightmare for the people in Chiapas. You know, our common friend Alejandra, whose family lives there, and the stories they tell are just terrible. So that's the issue with drugs. Probably there will be something better done now that Trump has made this a prime item in his agenda, and we will respond some way, no? Because we, as you said, the United States is big and it's a bully, and we'll do whatever they require if they structure the petition in a way that can be attended. No, if you ask somebody to do something that's impossible, then it doesn't happen. But if somebody is smart somewhere can make it a clear petition, that is likely to move, and it might benefit both of our countries. Now, let me take your second topic, which is illegal immigration. There we have somewhat of a structural problem in the world. I don't know if you're familiar with Branko Milanovic's work. Yes. But the way I read Branko's work is that what has happened with globalization is that we have somewhat of a middle class, the world middle class, that's gaining from globalization, and probably the big chunk of that global middle class is Chinese workers that work for export industries. So these guys have won money, and I would place there some of the workers that live in Mexico that are linked to the United States in the auto industry, and so we have like a segment of companies that have moved and to different places in the third world to export to the developing world, and they have been clear winners of this globalization. Then you have the other winners who are the owners of these companies that mostly live in the United States and in Europe, and the top 1% of the wealthiest people in the world. They have also been big winners with the globalization. But the interesting fact about Branko Milanovic's work is that the guys who haven't lost but haven't won anything is the lower classes, the red collar workers or blue collar workers in the United States and in Europe that have not seen benefits from that globalization. All the real wages have remained stagnant. In part, that has created some doubts in the United States on why this gap between qualified and unqualified personnel has remained as high as it has remained, even though the supply of qualified workers has been significant. And it probably has to do with this global relocation of economic activity, which in a sense is a reflection on the fact that the world is a place where we have very significant differences in income. And if you have somebody who earns $4 an hour, and you have in the United States or $8 an hour, $10 an hour, and you have somebody here who earns $10 a week, or if they're well paid, probably $10 a day, then you have an incentive to move. And the only way to stop that is like the force of gravity. People will like to move if they can, and you can stop it, no? Because human ingenuity usually circumvents government attempts to stop the flow of people. But given these differences, it's a big problem for the whole world. If you see it in Europe, you see it here. You start to see it in some places in Asia. And it has to do in China. It's mostly an internal problem because now they have big disparities inside China, and they are trying to deal with the political problems that's creating for them. And in Mexico, in a sense, that has created two Mexicos. No, the Mexico that is linked to the United States, and the Mexico that is not linked to the United States. And unfortunately, the Mexico that is not linked to the United States has voted to have a government that will pay more attention to them. And that is, in a sense, creating a new political regime which yesterday, just as you had the election in the United States, we were having a very critical voting process in the Supreme Court that essentially means that we are into uncharted territory, having a new political regime in Mexico. Having said that, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, will have the capacity to speak to Trump if Trump wants to speak, and they can reach agreements. And I believe we are moving outside of a traditional liberal regime that protected human rights, and we don't know where we're heading. That's essentially, there's a lot of question marks. If you want, we can talk a little bit more about it. But then let me take your second outrageous claims about people getting out of prisons and moving and madhouses and moving into the United States. The actual story is quite the opposite. When Lopez Obrador got into the presidency, he passed these laws that essentially made the right to a fair trial as a prerequisite to being in prison something of put a big question mark on it, because we introduced in our constitution early in the previous sexennium this clause that essentially says that if you commit a serious crime, then you go to prison no matter if you are innocent or not. And that is a mess. So now we have overpopulated prisons. The
We have
people in prison.
overpopulated prisons. I thought there were no prisons. I thought they all were sent out and paid by the Mexican government to the United
No,
States.
no, we have overpopulated prisons, mostly populated by poor people who can't pay their defense. And the rate of overpopulation in our prisons is about 40, 60%. And 30, 40% of those people have not received sentence. So they might spend many, many years in trial. There's this famous case of Florence Cassés. You probably heard about it, but her
Yes.
partner in crime is she got out 6 years after being convicted, but she didn't have a sentence, and she was declared innocent because there were violations in the procedure of their arrest, and her partner in crime is still in prison with no sentence, no, and then it's about 18 years. So essentially, that is the dark side of the lack of a rule of law in Mexico, and that is going to get tougher here. No, we're moving in a situation where the new president put a strong cop in charge of the Ministry of Security, and the army has all sorts of capacities now to do police work, which is a mess. But it's people are voting for that. People agree that that should be done because people are not happy with all the violence, and so we're having overpopulated prisons. The number of Central Americans in those prisons has increased dramatically because of these conversations in the previous Trump presidency. So I don't think those claims have backup in evidence.
And also is the organization, the OAS, the Organization of American States. So do you think also that maybe previously AMLO and Claudia Sheinbaum and Maduro and whatever, they're all getting together and putting together a special fund to empty out their prisons and send the worst of the populations, and they're using the fund to pay the cartels so the cartels can take this cherry-picked population of criminals and drug dealers and rapists and mental patients, and that they have this process of vetting all these people, choosing the worst.
No, that is crazy, Jeffrey. It doesn't make any sense with the data. I think what really happens is that if you have these opportunities in the U.S., what's happening is that the U.S. is getting the best and the brightest out of Mexico. No, people who are willing to risk a lot of put all their life savings into traveling to the U.S. and try to build a quiet life in the U.S. because they don't want to get arrested in any condition because they would get deported. So if you look at the statistics, illegal immigrants are probably among the people who are less likely to commit a crime because they know if they get in a traffic accident, they're going to get deported and they're going to have a very bad time. So they have to be very careful living their life in the U.S. and not bother anybody because they have too much at stake for a stupid thing to happen. Obviously, there's the drug dealers here and in the United States, and you have a lot of illegal things happening because you have. You have a good business exporting weapons, which you can buy legally in the United States and sell them here for drugs that you can get easily because the cartels run several regions of the country and then take them back to the U.S. So it's an economic motive that is running the business, and I hope we can do something about it, but it's not going to be easy. Now, let me take your last initial question, which had to do with trade and the tariffs. And one of the things that happened, if you look at Mexico and compare it to the rest of Latin America, including Brazil, what we see, if you look at the composition of exports, is that exports are much more complex than they used to be. When this modernization process started in Mexico in the 80s, 70% of Mexico's exports were oil. And that is in line with what happens with the rest of Latin America, where most of the exports are raw materials. So you have a traditional raw material, it's copper for Chile or all sorts of green things for Brazil, even though Brazil has some more industry, but still the composition of their trade is still dominated by raw materials. That happens in Peru, in Ecuador, all the countries. What has happened in Mexico in the last 30 years is that the complexity of the exports has increased tenfold. And before Mexico was exporting some 30, $40 billion, mostly of oil, and now we're exporting 300 or $400 billion, mostly of intermediate manufacturers. What has happened is that the trade structures have intertwined. And if you put a tariff in the middle of that, and it's estimated that by the time a car moves out of Mexico, to the United States as an export, the components have moved in and out about 9 times, because the brakes are made partly in the US, then they come here and they are reassembled into a bigger portion, and it gets exported, and then it gets brought back. So if you imagine if you put 25% or 50% tax on that at every step, but then it will harm terribly Mexico and the United States. It would harm Mexico more, but it will still be a competitive disadvantage for the United States, because you have a lot of cheap raw materials and labor in other parts of the world, and where the United States source of that simple hand workers is here in Mexico. So it's likely that the entrepreneurial group around Donald Trump will tell him how these things work, and probably they will reach an agreement, and he will claim a victory on the fentanyl wars, and those things will not happen. So, but the problem is we're dealing with people who are, in the case of the U.S., has a strong ego component, and in the case of Mexico, we have a strong ideological component, and we don't know exactly where that heads. The traditional liberal values that guided this integration are no longer in fashion in both countries, and how a different illiberal type of agreement between Mexico and the United States will play out is still anybody's guess.
Well, thank you for thank you for remembering all the questions I asked first, and doing such a good job at answering them. I have some follow-up questions of that. First, with respect to the work on the consequences of globalization, one is we talk, in economics, they talk about this concept, and to simplify it for people, Pareto optimality, which is basically you'll do a policy if one person's better off and nobody is worse off, then that's a good policy, because overall it's net beneficial to society without there being any trade-offs. Nobody has suffered an adverse consequence of the policy. Some people are benefited. Obviously, a better policy has more people benefiting with nobody suffering. But as long as nobody suffers and somebody benefits, that's better because then that's no trade-offs involved. You're not having some person benefit. You're not making a value judgment saying, I want this person to benefit and this other person will pay for this person's benefit. Here you have somebody benefiting with nobody necessarily paying for that benefit. So what we don't have an example of, in the absence of this globalization, the class that has not been better off, how much worse off they might be if this didn't exist. So they might not be better off, but they might be better off than they would have been in the absence of globalization. So, I remember when I took my first trip to Mexico in 1993. There were all the movie theaters were owned by the government. There were almost no movie theaters. They were in horrible condition, and there were no current movies played. There was no real cable television. So your choices in what you had for entertainment were really very limited, and the same with restaurants, also very, very limited. So so people had low incomes and they had few choices, and then Mexico began to open up, and people had, a lot more choices. And if you look based upon how people consume, the consumption, that people are, are much better off. How many Mexicans own cars now? How many Mexicans own their own houses? The choices they have on where to eat, the clothing they buy, and entertainment options. I mean, all of that has basically been increased for a substantial amount of the population, and the population that has not benefited from that, we don't know how worse off would be in the absence of that, because we don't know how much poorer Mexico would be. If Mexico didn't open up, probably never would have been investment grade status, would have not have had access to capital markets, and Mexico today might resemble Venezuela. So I would think that the poor people in Mexico are better off than the poor people than the poor people in Mexico. So I think someone would rather be a poor person in Mexico than a poor person in Venezuela. And maybe countries that didn't open up, they all would look like Venezuela now, because they'd have no access to capital from the capital markets, and the entrepreneurs, unless they're tied to an activity that's related to the government, where it's a completely corrupt activity, where they're making all their money from rent-seeking behavior, there'd be really no entrepreneurial class. So, so things could be, it's not usual that things say stagnant, because the world moves. So if you're not moving while the world is moving, it means you're regressing. So relative to everyone else. So I think the flaw in these studies are, is you don't really know what things would be like if there wasn't this level of globalization. And the Americans today also, who some of them in the industries that have been adversely impacted by globalization, they don't know what the US would look like today in the absence of globalization. If the rest of the world was poor, okay, how many markets would be shut down to American firms that do business all over the world, if the rest of the world was not consuming American products, and American companies didn't have access to a pool of foreign capital, a pool of foreign labor, and a pool of goods made in other countries. So if the United States did not export much and import much, we don't really know what the distribution of wealth would look like, under that scenario either. So, so I think we don't really have a controlled experiment, except we do know one thing. We do know from studies done by several think tanks is that there's a great reward for economic freedom, and countries that have economic freedom are a lot wealthier than countries that don't have economic freedom. And there's a cost associated with not pursuing economic freedom as a goal, which is basically making a country, a society poorer. So, so that's my opinion. What's your opinion with respect to the statements I made?
Well, it's a difficult thing. We can go back to the origins, which is how I teach my students to think about these things. And the first thinker on these issues was the founder of the profession, Adam Smith.
Yes.
And he had an interesting idea. He didn't have any models, but he had very good intuition. And what he said is, if we specialize and we have greater division of labor, we will be better off. And if we all specialize, then that would create better conditions of production for whoever specializes. And that was his main idea. The wealth of nation is the product of specialization. And,
Right.
And then that was complemented by Ricardo, who said, well, if you put the concept of comparative advantage, I really don't care that much how the others are doing, as long as I can use my advantage in specializing into getting cheaper things outside and than what it would cost me to do them. And then we all benefit. But that requires open borders. So there's a lot of advantage in having goods that can move freely around the world. The big question mark is that I don't think neither the new US government nor the recently elected Mexican government believe deeply in these things. Their statements are more or less opposed to them. And the history of this is what happened in the 20s in the world. No, one of the side effects of this closing up of many of the government was the Great Depression. No, as countries closed their borders and we started becoming suspicious of one another, the world became a very nasty place. And I guess we should all remember that going forward with what we're living today. There's a lot of question marks on what people are doing, especially the people in charge of government, that can think that, okay, I can put these taxes, or I don't need the United States, and I will look into Southern America for allies and talk nicely to Maduro and to other crazy leaders in Cuba or whatever, and then we start confronting each other and if that borders into affecting this thing that has been knit down by entrepreneurs, this complexity that I was talking about is something that was done by a lot of Texan entrepreneurs and Mexican entrepreneurs that are more intertwined among them than what Texas has in common with other regions of the United States and what Mexico has in common with other places. Our big problem is that the gap between those who have linked to the United States and those who haven't linked to the United States is 7-1. So that puts the poor regions in Mexico at the Ghana level in Africa, and it's bad. And we have that all within the same set of borders, and if we don't do something about it, the political instability that creates might turn the window to having reasonable people discussing how we should trade with the U.S. No, and if we start listening to religious ideological ideas instead of looking at what benefits us, then we can get into really nasty territory.
Yeah, I think that, well, I'm going to, there's an audience question, but I'd like to make one statement about some of the points you made earlier. And the fact is that I think, in a world's or individuals somewhat governed by, social Darwinism to a certain extent, or what a financial economist might call, seeking arbitrage opportunities. That's what individuals do. That's what you describe people doing. If it's an arbitrage opportunity, people will exploit it. It's not just Wall Street that exploits arbitrage. Human beings exploit arbitrage. Whenever there's an opportunity, people assess the upside of the opportunity associated with the cost of the risk of trying to take advantage of that opportunity. And people who are very, very risk averse will decide not to take that opportunity. And people who are more entrepreneurial will look at the trade-offs between the risk they're assuming, and here the risk is, going through the process of having to deal with cartels and the money that you'll pay and your life savings to get to the border, knowing, you might not make it. And there's a possibility or probability you won't make it, versus the benefit of doing that. And that creates the incentive for people to do it. So it's basically having every individual in their life do the same type of calculation that Wall Street does, which is saying are there arbitrage opportunities I can exploit to make my life better, to make me wealthier, make my life better, make my family's life better, and to the extent there is, I'm going to deploy my ingenuity as an individual to figure out how to profit off that arbitrage opportunity.
That's what migrants do.
Exactly. That's what migrants do. Exactly. So I think that's what you had described, and I'm in complete agreement on it, and I'm just using my vocabulary to describe it, since I'm an arbitrageur. So now the audience question is, why has Mexico never got a grip on the cartels?
Well, it's difficult to put. We have a deep problem in Mexico that wasn't addressed during the reform period, and I guess that was the biggest omission, which has to do with the rule of law. And in the long term, I believe the only way, because you can crack cartels, and if you have a elite team and that has happened, and you go against the drug lords and you put them in prison, you send them to the United States, and you take. But then as long as there's a market there for these drugs, there's some other people who are going to occupy their places. So the only way to control it is to have a general rule of law that works at the local level. And that doesn't exist in Mexico. No, the quality of the local judges is a complete disaster, and we are not moving close to making it better. And that was the monumental decision that while you were voting for Donald Trump in the US, here, Supreme Court was going to vote for something that would sustain some of the advances in the rule of law, and we're moving back. So that's not happening, and I guess that's the biggest pending issue we would have, because we did everything on the book onto how to become a more developed country, and the big missing item is rule of law. As you would call it in the US, it's more complex because we need to have certain types of police people, certain types of judges, and the way it's a system that needs to work, and we don't have it. And we're not close to developing a good working judicial mechanism, not only the judges, but the police and the defense structure, because you need to have people who defend people who are accused for the system to work, and we don't have any of that. It's very poor. So that is one of the big pending things, and I think that's what it's not a thing of will. It's not that the government wants to go against the cartels, because there's a market there. You can crack the heads of a couple of drug dealers, but if you don't have a system of rule of law working, you really can't stop it at the local level, and we don't have that.
Yeah. I don't know, outside of maybe a few Scandinavian countries where there is decent rule of law. The United States is no longer, the last time I've looked at the statistics, and I haven't looked in the last couple of months or so, but the U.S. was no longer in the top 10 in think tanks' evaluation of rule of law countries, as neither is it in the top 10 in economic freedom, which had been in the top 10 for a very long period of time. And for anybody listening and watching, I don't want people to think that this is a phenomena that occurred during the Biden administration. No, it's been for the last several administrations, consistently, pretty much after the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. Basically, consistently since then, the U.S. has not been a top 10 countries in economic freedom, nor a top 10 country in rule of law. That was true of the Obama administration, equally true of the Trump administration, and equally true of the Biden administration. So people who might want to just blame Biden on it, no, it's been a deterioration for quite a long period of time in the United States, is that there has been a degradation of economic freedom, and this is a degradation of rule of law. And outside of small homogeneous societies, there seems to have been a global debasement and degradation of rule of law. How much of this is related to cronyism and the concentration of wealth, and the concentration of wealth, or the concentration of poverty, that has distorted the political process in a way where people are more outcome oriented than process oriented. And if you become outcome oriented rather than process oriented, then clearly rule of law suffers as a consequence of that, as does economic freedom. Economic freedom and rule of law are process oriented systems. So once you decide that you want to interfere with the process to create an outcome, and that outcome you want to produce as a result of lobbying or other political pressure, you've distorted both economic freedom and you've distorted rule of law. So I think, given that a lot of policies are basically driven by pandering of specific interest groups, each time we pander to an interest group, we're degrading and debasing rule of law, and we're degrading and debasing economic freedom.
Yeah, if you look in Mexico at the World Justice Project, I think it's an interesting exercise where they don't just look at one indicator, but look at how the judges are working, how the police is working, and they put a compound number. We have deteriorated dramatically in the last 10 years. And that's bad news because we were bad to start with. No, I guess we moved from being like number 50 in the global rank to being like number 80 or something in the global rank, which is pretty bad given that in other items we rank up much higher. No, given that we're the 12th or 11th economy in the world.
Yes, I always I remembered having conversations with somebody who headed up a think tank in Mexico, and the think tank was focused in on measuring competitiveness in Mexico. So IMCO, Instituto Mexicano por Competitividad. I remember, so I was invited to their first major luncheon where they put this very impressive book together. I think a matter of fact, a small segment of that group book, I contributed something that I co-authored. It was like a 2 or 3 page thing, very, very brief, that I co-authored, I think, with Luis Rubio, or maybe Luis Rubio co-authored it with me. So, but either way, so I was at the lunch, and of course, the lunch, they talked about the fact is that the most important thing for Mexicans' competitiveness was rule of law. That came out to be the most important factor, as almost any economist would say, is that rule of law is the foundation for economic freedom. So, but since it's how ironic is it that since Mexico has created this institute supposedly to enhance the competitiveness of the Mexican economy, and this institute has published very excellent scholarly publications, with all this data and with rigorous analytics. Yet, in spite of the production of all this information that's very rigorous in nature, okay, Mexico has become less competitive, and rule of law has deteriorated so significantly. Probably they should shut down the institute, and people should be doing something different with their lives, because it's been an abject failure. No blaming them, but it is to blame for those people who have financed them, who were some of them, the biggest, most important, entrepreneurs, or I don't know if necessarily entrepreneurs is the right term, because maybe they were the most successful rent seekers. So, and that was their greatest skill. So I have another audience question. Does the American state even want Mexico to get its house in order?
Well, that's a big question, because I think the biggest cooperation we would want to have with the United States has to do with this, and there were some attempts. No, the Merida project started with that idea, but then there were some efforts into pushing that agenda, but in the end it became a lot of military exports. And a lot of that ended up in the hands of the cartels, so it was a real mess. So I don't think it's going to be high in Trump's agenda to push rule of law in Mexico. And we had a taste of the type of intervention we might see, because I think the general establishment in the U.S.
Raul, I think you froze for a second. So you said,
where was I?
repeat the last minute. Just you froze for a minute.
So with the election of Donald Trump, I don't think the rule of law is going to be high in the agenda, but rather what we saw at the end of the Biden administration, or what we're seeing, which is the #1 drug dealer was Mayo Zambada. And people knew where he was, and they didn't. But what happened is, miraculously, Mayo Zambada appeared being driven by the son of Chapo Guzman in the border of Texas. No, so now he's being processed in the U.S. It's unbelievable that somebody in the United States did not know that was happening. So I think that's the kind of cooperation we're going to have moving forward, and that is very messy. because it just moves, stirs the situation, but does not help to create the institutional controls we need regarding rule of law. Because it's just, you stir the whole thing, and are we here yet? Yeah. Losing.
Yeah, your internet is degrading,
We
Raul.
stir the whole thing, but it doesn't help to nothing in the law.
Raul, I think you're. I don't know if you can hear me, but your internet has degraded. You want to try turning off the video and seeing if you just do the audio, whether that's better. Oh, here you're back. Okay, good.
Hello, Jeff.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you again.
Okay, I moved to that. Well, we also have some infrastructure problems here in Mexico, as you can see. Now I moved to the cellular network to keep the conversation going. Just as an example of what
It's
happens.
interesting. Your cellular network is more reliable than your Wi-Fi.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
In all the places that I stay at, because I kind of live somewhat of a nomadic life. I always have I have multiple internet providers, and I get this technology so that it was not complicated. That I always have an IT person come install, so that I get almost every internet provider, and that my system is always picking up the strongest signal of all the internet providers. So even with that, I still have experiences sometimes when my internet goes down.
I need to get your technology, because that's everyday business here in Mexico. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't get attended. But as I was mentioning, we do get the most important drug lord was apprehended in a mysterious way. He is being charged in the New York court, I believe, right now. And but that apprehending drug lords this way, instead of having the system do it in a systematic way, because there is rule of law, that would be the ideal situation. But just getting the drug lords will not help if we don't do something on the institutional side, and I don't see it in the agenda. And it hasn't, as you said, it's not something that is the problem of this administration or the previous. It's a long-standing issue in Mexico not to have somebody care about developing good rule of law institutions.
I think that yes, I don't think there's any point in the U.S. making, and one is the government should not be making investments in other countries. Each country should have the obligation of providing a framework, an institutional framework for private enterprise, both domestic and foreign private enterprise, to invest in their country. I guess the way that Mexico was able to get entrepreneurs to invest in Mexico was basically signing NAFTA. And what did NAFTA accomplish? NAFTA created, at least for commercial transactions, international bilateral not trilateral relationships, that there was a rule of law system that would supersede the domestic law system. So that basically, if there were disputes related to trading amongst and between the parties of Canada, the U.S. and Mexico, that there was a legal process that people trusted. And in the absence of that legal process, there would have been events. So essentially, for business transactions, companies that operated in Mexico, or entrepreneurs that were operating on a scale where they were doing business across the borders, that they would basically opting out of the Mexican legal system, and they were opting into a system where property rights were well protected, and it was that comfort in the protection of property rights that made people feel more comfortable, investing in Mexico. So it seems to me that's the problem for all developing countries. The challenge is how to get entrepreneurs to believe that property rights will be protected. And Mexico accomplished that through NAFTA. I think that was NAFTA's greatest success, is that is the sense that property rights were protected, and to the extent that property rights were protected, investment came, and the investment that came forced Mexican businesses to improve because they had to compete with the international companies that came. So other countries have decided not to choose that route, and maybe the U.S. discourages institutional development by basically saying, I'll give you money, as long as you're my ally and your friend and you're supporting me at the UN and you're doing these things, I'll enable your dysfunctionality, as long as you stay loyal to me. So maybe what the U.S. doing is not only not helpful, but could be harmful. And it's not that, and if it is harmful, which I think it is, it's not. It's this is not a case of the law of unexpected consequences. This consequence is understood when it's being done. So I don't think this is an unintended consequence. I think it's perceived as an acceptable trade-off.
Now, let me give you two examples on where I would place the long-term opportunities for this to improve, because I don't think we're going to be able to do it on our own. We need to have some sort of lever coming from outside. And what sort of lever can that be? Take one example. Spain was poorer than Mexico in 1970. And after, in the late 70s, it joined the European community, and that served as a level to pull them all the way up into development. So now Spain is a regular citizen in the European community, and they improved dramatically. They have their problems, but it's there. The place where I see an opportunity is the Mexican American community. What you have is some 20 million people that I would suppose at this stage they produce more than the rest of the Mexicans by living in the United States. And what has happened because of this that I was mentioning before, that they have, the first generation have to be very strict law-abiding people because they don't want to call attention on them because they would get deported. So, but then the second and the third generation, they integrate and they want to be full-fledged American citizens that are respected, and then they hate to be compared to drug dealers and the like. That's not something that makes them happy. They would like to be perceived like Greek Americans or Irish Americans or Americans that have a cultural heritage from abroad, but that's a nice heritage, not a nasty heritage. And so eventually, I think the Mexican American community, which is it's our best reserve of human capital for the future. And eventually they will want to take control over the mess that's happening down here. And that's the other window. So it's either something like what happened in Spain, which could be, the world is crazy, so we could join the European community if it changes its name, and that would be the lever, or NAFTA should continue to move, or eventually the Mexican Americans will have the opportunities here and they'll come for them. Because it's going to make much more sense once their possibilities to grow within the United States reach a certain level, and they find that it makes arbitrage sense to establish here and sort of kick out the cronies in local government and get things into their hands. So there might be complex but interesting long-term possibilities to have a brighter future.
I hope so. Here's another audience question. What is the attitude of the average man on the street in Mexico towards Trump as POTUS, as President of the United States? So I assume some of your friends, you're talking politics and U.S. politics in this election. So, who did people that you were speaking with? I won't ask you to reveal your own preferences. You can do that if you want, but but at least in the conversations you're having, what do you think in general were people's preferences, and what do you think their attitude towards Trump is?
Well, given that Trump portrays us as the bad guys, he doesn't have that much rating here. No, my uncle Javier, who passed away, was probably the only open Trumpist that I know, but he passed away last year, so he's no longer here. There's a small crowd that are pro-Trump here. But I mean, it's a wild card. I mean, having this nationalist bent, which is something that is also happening to us, well, doesn't help because you don't eat nationalism. No, nationalism then gets in the way of doing business, and it's a bad recipe for both countries.
So how do you envision, again, this is pure speculation, but here you have Trump coming in now saying, and you know, how much of this is posturing and how much of this is his style of negotiating and how much of it will be actually reinforced by actions. You know, it's hard to tell. But here you have someone coming in, he's gonna, you know, call up and say, hi, you know, I'm president again, you know, you got to help me shut the border. You know, you got to do everything I say. And if you don't do it, you know, here the tariff regime. I don't care what document I signed. Okay, it's worthless to me. Try have luck enforcing it. You might get a judgment in court, but figure out how you're going to enforce that judgment against me. Because remember, I have immunity, so I can do whatever I want because I have immunity to do whatever I want. So I can abrogate whatever treaty. And I doubt my friends in the Republican legislature are going to impeach me over me abrogating this treaty with you. They'll be cheering, and the MAGA crowd will be cheering. So basically, I don't care about any document I signed with you that I negotiated, that I signed, that I said was a great treaty. You know, times have changed. You need a spanking. You know, like Tucker Carlson said, I need to spank you. Here's I'm going to spank you. And by the way, I'm also going to remind you that, you know, that the free trade agreement that I'm already de facto destroying I will allow to on a de jure basis lapse, so it doesn't exist. You know, when it expires, I won't even renegotiate it. What you know, you as a Mexican citizen, how would you want your government to respond to a conversation like that? You know, if you were in the room and Claudia Sheinbaum called you up and said, you know, Raul, you've been a part of a lot of administrations. You were mentored by, you know, one of the great people in Mexico, Jesus Reyes Arolas. You know, everybody thinks, you know, Pedro Aspe might have been the most successful finance minister in the history of the country. You know, and you've had access, you know, to all these people. You've worked closely with them. You got to know them. You've accumulated a lot of wisdom. You were there part of the opening up of Pemex. So you own all this stuff. You know, Raul, what should I do? How should I respond?
Well,
So
the good thing about not being in government is that I can say crazy things. No, so historically, the United States has followed a policy where what you call the Monroe Doctrine, which says America for Americans, and that essentially has meant that you don't want nobody messing in your backyard. The United States has a complicated attitude there because. Do you want the Chinese to be here or not? Even if the Chinese just come for the local market because you shut the border, so we become part of China's influence region, and that's not good. But if you don't let any opportunities to the local government to keep NAFTA working, that's the kind of thing that can happen. Now, on my scale of values, what I would prefer is to do something like what I just mentioned. Why don't we become part of Europe? I mean, Europe has an identity crisis. If Europeans wanted to absorb Mexico into the European community, in normal times that would be seen as a threat. But with Donald Trump, probably there's a window of opportunity to do something like that. So, okay, let's knock the door in Europe and try to become part of Europe. Obviously, we have very bad relationship with Spain right now, and that doesn't work. But I mean, you told me to say things. That's the kind of recommendation I would make. No, and if we become part of the European community, we would have these pressures to have a rule of law and a set of institutional mechanisms that come imported and that would allow us to work better. So it's not easy, but there are ways out.
well, I would, if I was advising Claudia, my response was, I'd say, you know, Donald, Can I put you on hold for a second? Because I think I have a Zoom call with Vladimir and Mr. G right now. I think they have an interesting conversation about BRICS. So you think about whether it's better for Mexico to be part of NAFTA or to be part of BRICS. So while I'm speaking to them, why don't I leave you with that to think about? So what do you think about that as a response?
No, that's exactly what I
Exactly.
mentioned. No,
Europe, but BRICS, yes.
yeah,
So
I said China first and then Europe, but that's what's coming. So I think in the end we will be more practical. So it depends on what Trump wants to put as trophies to save face with his prior commitments, and then I guess business will influence the rest of his decisions. That's the hope.
yes, I mean, I assume that since he seems to like the stock market as an indicator very much, I think the stock price, a lot of these automobiles. Well, who knows? Elon Musk might be saying kill NAFTA because that'll kill all the automobile industry. And Tesla will be the only auto manufacturer alive. So why don't you go ahead and exit NAFTA? Just make sure you preserve my deals with my suppliers and my supply chain network, so that basically Tesla can now buy up the whole automobile industry very cheap, since you're going to help me destroy the American automobile industry. So,
Well, we have a big test on the Tesla mega factory in Monterrey. So Musk put that on hold, and to get a flavor of what's coming, we should look at how that decision plays out.
what about when did he commit to doing a factory there, and what happened? I'm not aware of this.
Oh, he made a big show, and he came here to visit the governor of Nuevo León, and there was López Obrador, tried to lure him to have the mega factory built closer to Mexico City, and then the governor managed to convince him, that's what he said, to stay in Monterrey, and then he announced and he bought the land, and then he put it on hold when he started joining the Trump campaign.
Oh, so this is very recent that he put the project on
Yeah.
hold. Did he get any deal in getting the land or permits or anything like that?
Yeah, he has the land and he has all the commitment of the local government, and you had a whole bunch of people who invested on the plans to build a mega factory. It was a done deal, but then it stopped. So it's going to be interesting to know what happens there.
Oh, so I guess with this attack on Mexico, he decided it would be it would be a point of vulnerability if someone so close to the Trump campaign was now building this huge factory, mega factory in Monterrey. So I guess he stopped it, and judging from the stock market's response to Trump's victory, it seems like the market's highly confident that Trump will reward Tesla a lot. So when people take a look at how much Musk invested in the campaign, let's just say it was a low risk investment at the time, because Trump was still up in most of the polls. He was still up in the prediction markets. So it was tight, but he was still up. I guess then Musk made this like $130 million bet or something like that. But today he got about $13 billion worth of value increase in Tesla, which a large percentage of that 13 billion goes into his pocket. So his return on investment was very large. I sent a brief note to some of my friends today, not meant to be a political comment. I just said, I wrote to them, I don't want to get my statement wrong. Today we have a unique event study to help us understand the value of cronyism. The stock market is marginally up in pre-market trading, but DJT, which is Trump's entity, is up more than 30%. It was the most up in pre-market trading, and Tesla was up 13% in pre-market trading. So with DGT the best market performer, and Tesla the top 10 market movers pre-market. So then I say cronyism pays. Crime might pay, but cronyism pays much, much, much better. So so there's a high return to cronyism, and the fact that Tesla's now worth significantly more than it was yesterday. And the only thing that happened was, there was no policy on the part. If anything, the policies of the Biden administration were to encourage electric vehicles, and Trump supposedly has a policy saying this is stupidity to encourage electric vehicles. We gotta milk out the fossil fuel industry as much as we can, because this is American resources it has, and we got to be, well, America is already the greatest fossil fuel producer in the world. So in the history of humanity, happened during the Biden administration. Not that I'm an advocate of the Biden administration. I'm an advocate of the fact that entrepreneurs, no matter who's president, figure out how to succeed. So, just like the migrant who's arbitraging, borders to look for a better life, an entrepreneur doesn't say, gee, Biden's president, America's screwed. I'm not going to show up at work anymore. I'm not going to do my job. I'm not going to look to pursue profits. I'm going to wait for Trump to come back in office. Then I'll try and figure out how to maximize profits. But right now, I'm just trying to figure out, I'm just going to take a vacation until Trump's back, and I'm going to make no effort to figure out how to maximize profits. No, every entrepreneur knows that they got to figure out how to make money independent of politics. So, and successful entrepreneurs are successful at doing that. They know how to run their businesses and operate their business successfully, independent of whoever is president and independent of the policies, and they all try and influence the policies as much as they can. And, and the evidence is that they do a pretty good job at doing that. So I think that's
some get more money if they join cronyism.
Yes, but cronyism is probably the most productive activity. So if we look at how much money is invested, in cronyism and rent-seeking behavior, that's what lobbying is about. That's why I say, I'm sure for most people, cronyism pays much more than criminals. I don't think that successful criminals are anywhere near have accumulated the type of wealth that successful cronies have achieved through rent-seeking behavior. So cronyism might be, unfortunately, it might be the most productive pursuit of an entrepreneur, is ingratiating themselves with power and then distorting the rules, for their benefit. And I think actually in some of these studies, when this issue used to be talked about in Mexico. I don't know if it's still talked about in Mexico, but when IMCO had started, I remembered one of the meals that IMCO had organized, they had a video coming in of Gary Becker, and Gary Becker specifically talked about the issue of cronyism. I guess now in Mexico, it's part of the political discourse. Is there any real discussion anymore regarding cronyism and how to make Mexico more competitive?
It's in the center of the political agenda, and the guys who win the elections, or then in this case the woman who win the elections, say their main agenda item is to fight corruption, but then you see cronies flying around with impunity, and so it's a mixed message, and the institutions that would help fight cronyism are not being developed. No, it's not in the agenda.
So that's first. What do you think? Going back to your comment about what Mexican Americans do and the influence they could have on Mexico, what do you really? How do you really see that working? How do you see Mexican Americans who now have accumulated wealth, who still care about Mexico, who still have family in Mexico, still feel their roots in Mexico, and still and still have real concerns and a patriotism towards Mexico? What do you think they could really accomplish to have Mexico have a type of real institutional reform that would promote economic freedom and rule of law? And again, you can't have economic freedom without rule of law. So,
but the great thing about the Mexican American community is that it's being educated in the United States, and even if you believe that the rule of law is not the biggest item in the agenda in the United States. It's much, much, much better than here. So you have these people that are educated, that they believe in that way of succeeding because it's the story of their life, and they want to be perceived better, and they envy the Italians or the Irish or the Greeks that have all these Greek American, Irish American, or Italian American communities that are a source of pride. And the Mexican American community has this mixed message because all you get in TV is drug lords and killing and nasty stories being told about their ancestry, instead of talking about the culture and all the other important things that we have here that are not showing off because you have all these things. So you have a big interest group that has not organized politically to influence activities in Mexico. But now they have much more money than all the Mexicans together as a group. So eventually they'll figure it out and say, okay, we want to live better in the United States. We better fix Mexico, because otherwise we won't get away with these stories. And as Mexico goes down the drain, their ancestry's reputation will go down the drain. So it will be in their collective interest to organize and do something. But right now, we're still looking for the entrepreneurial politician in the US that can help do some of this. And that's a source of hope, in a sense, no? Because you have enough entrepreneurs there to turn around this country.
No, I hope so. When you were young, fresh out of MIT, and seeing all the people who signed NAFTA, who began this process of reform, not only significant economic reform, but significant political reform. So we had the end of the pre-dynasty, which was considered like the perfect dictatorship, and that has been basically been destroyed. Mexico entered into NAFTA. We've seen all this significant amount of investment. We see the type of manufacturing in Mexico is a lot more sophisticated now, not only with respect to just automobiles, but also aerospace as well. In other sectors, as you touched upon, the value added of Mexicans' exports is a higher value added export than it used to be, which was only just commodity driven. So with very little to no value added, type of exports. So you're going out there and you're working for some of the great minds behind these reform efforts. People really committed to a reform and an institutional reform. People not just committed to their own egos and the power that they could accumulate and amass, but actually people who were real patriots who were devoting their lives, their careers to a political reform of openness and transparency. So if you take a look at where Mexico is today relative to where you might thought Mexico would be, did you ever give much time to thinking about, this is what I think Mexico will look like 10, 20 years from now? Or you were just too busy to continue to work day in and day out and didn't really think long term about, what would be the product of all this effort of the reform movement?
I guess we had some blindness. I mean, over time, this thing I just said in passing about the rule of law, we all know that the rule of law is important, but we don't devote enough time to understand how to set it up. So what we did is we signed NAFTA, and we said that's going to create some arbitrage, because now people will have this reference and have these panels where they can resort to the tri-national justice structures that will help business work better, and it did. But we really didn't devote enough time onto how to structure the working of the legal system. And I guess that's an omission of the profession. We were a bunch of economists, and we were thinking and we did everything that the playbook said we had to do. Well, actually, I work with Cedillo. There's a there's a fun story that now has reached an endpoint where I was working in the campaign with Cedillo, with Luis Telles, and in the different conversations.
Oh, Raul, you disappeared. I don't want to be left in suspense of this conversation. Raul? I'm going to wait a minute to hopefully Raul will come back. So hopefully you're as interested in hearing the story as I am. Whoever's listening to this or will listen to this podcast, I'm going to see if I can text him on and see if he knows he's Raul. Well, I'll give Raul a few seconds to see if he can come back. If not, this will be an abrupt ending to.
Okay.
Yeah, Raul's back. Okay, good. Okay.
Whenever I start talking about difficult subjects, somebody cuts me out. I'm starting to get nervous. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, and I was.
Yes.
But yes, can you hear me?
I don't hear you. No.
I can hear you. I'm gonna
Hello?
text. Yes, I can hear you.
I see you, but I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm texting.
Okay, but I can't hear you.
I don't know why.
Let me. This. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't listen to you. I'll get out and rejoin. Let me see if that works.
Okay. Sorry for these technical problems. Well, I guess unfortunately you're stuck just looking at me while Raul's getting back. It can't be very pleasant.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. You're freezing again, Raul.
Hello?
Yes, Raul. Why don't you try just putting yourself on audio and cut out the video, and see if that helps? Maybe you have a.
Can you
Yes.
hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, well, then I'll tell you the story and probably we can close with that. But we started doing this reform to the judicial system, and it didn't work in the end. No, it did work for the elite, and so we had a functioning top level judicial system that served for foreign protection, property rights protection, to give access through injunctions, what we call amparo here in Mexico, to protect the elite. But it didn't reach the bottom layers of society. So people were disconnected from the working of the judicial system. And whenever they had a contact with the judicial system, it was really bad, because if somebody stole some bread from a Walmart store, they got into jail, and then they had a very nasty time surviving that if they did. And then many times the way they survive is by joining the crooks that control the jails. So it became a factory of crooks. and it was a really messy thing, and um, we never really paid enough attention to that, and we're not doing it, and it was across the board, and it was some sort of blindness on the nitty gritty of how to do it, on the part of this group of people who were pushing the reform, that they believed in it, but they didn't have the know-how. So I guess it's a problem of cross-disciplinary teaching we need to do with economists in particular, and to have more cross-disciplinary working in general to look at how these systems work. And that's the main pending issue I think we have in Mexico right now. And I'm not optimist that it's going to be fixed soon.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, in the people that I met in Mexico, and I met a lot of very, very smart people, successful, well accomplished people in their lives, many PhDs from the top universities, but with limited practical experience, especially with respect to capital markets. And that should be understood because Mexico didn't have a capital market, so they never had the opportunity of accumulating that type of experience. So it's natural. It's not a criticism. It's an observation and comment, but not a criticism. So I get invited to this conference at Stanford for the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law, and they're talking about the reform processes in Mexico. And in there was Olga Sanchez Cordero talking about the reforms, and Paco Gil was there, Pepe Toño was there. So a group of people, and they were talking about the electoral reforms, the stock market law, and all these other reforms. And so it was my turn to talk. So when it got to my turn to talk, I said Mexico is the country of the efficient breach. There are beautiful laws. The problem with all the laws is that they're not really enforceable, and they actually provide incentives to breach, because to the extent that if you expend, at least in commercial transactions, in generally the profit from breaching many agreements is greater than the cost if you're convicted. So basically, the legal system is incentivizing breaching. And then when it came to the stock market law, I told Paco, I said, look at this law. You have these provisions in this law, but there are numerous issues. One issue is there's no real discovery process. So there's no way of mitigating information asymmetry. So to the extent that some party can control, the information and can benefit information asymmetry, the role in courts is to basically mitigate information asymmetry. And there's nothing in these processes that actually mitigate information asymmetry. The other problem is what's the incentive to do a civil lawsuit? The fact is that the return from the lawsuit is greater than the cost of filing a lawsuit. In Mexico, the cost of filing the lawsuit is greater than the expected benefit of the lawsuit because of how damages are defined. So there's a very limited definition of what damages are. So basically, you have to think about the process. You think about the process as that, one, there's not great discovery. So one is whatever you would need to prove, you would need access to getting information from the other party that you're suing to have that put on the table, so the people making a judgment on the case have all the facts. But basically, you won't be able to perfect discovery. So the probability that you'll win a case is lower because you won't be able to mitigate information asymmetry. So, and then even if you win the case, the definition of damages are so narrow, and the legal costs of filing the suit, how long it'll take, the time value of money, and the time and value and effort you have to put into winning a lawsuit, at the end, you'll never file a lawsuit. So what's the point of having a law that nobody will ever use because the expected economic benefit from using that law is negative? So if there's a negative return to the enforcement of the law, then it's like the law doesn't exist because nobody will ever use it. So you have to think about how people would have the incentive to use it, and how people incentive to use it is if there's an expected benefit associated with it. And given the fact there is no expected benefit, the law will be useless. So, but that type of logic, and Paco was, as is a very smart guy, but nobody had made that argument to him, previously. And he later had me in to speak with Pepe Toño to make my suggestions. But after he took my suggestions to the Mexican lawyers who were advising him, they basically stripped out everything I had suggested.
But it has to do with a much bigger set of items that have to do with the way the police forces are structured. We have this division between the preventive police and the judicial police, which is a mess. And when you start, and the law, as you mentioned, is not bad. I mean, I did with a bunch of lawyers from the National University a very detailed study on all the process. And then we looked at what has to happen for this to work. And then how the capacities of the Mexican government at different levels were set up to have those things work. And everything was red lights. No, I mean, you don't have the capacity to do investigation of any sort. It's very
right,
weak. So you have some elite group that can do tailor-made investigations for something that's politically important, but it's not accessible to the community at large. No, so that's a big problem, and it's not something that you can fix with a law. It's a slow process of building these institutions, and you need to have a common, continuous pressure coming from a source abroad, mostly, to have it working. So we had some of that in place by NAFTA, but not enough to change the system. And now we're putting it on hold again.
that's sad. Well, um, I always like to give my guests the final word or words, and so whatever questions I didn't ask that you wish I asked, or anything that you might want to say that you didn't get the opportunity of saying, now's your chance to close out. So go ahead, Raul.
Well, we covered a lot of ground. So, I mean, I still think we need to, and it's part of something that the business community needs to do. And so essentially, the decent business community needs to counteract the dark forces that are building around the political sphere that has no control on how to protect the life of decent people who want to make the best for their families and have an honest earning. No, so hopefully we will be able to come together and develop that type of thing, even if our governments are not helping.
So I'll ask one more question, that I'll give you the last word on this one question for many of the people here is an American audience. What would be the hope? What would be your hope for the future? The type of dialogue that Claudia Sheinberg and Donald Trump will have regarding the most constructive, mutual beneficial relationship between the United States and Mexico.
Well, one of the big dangers we're having now is when Donald Trump is mixing trade with fighting drug cartels, then we are putting the brighter side of our relationship, which is trade, mixed with the darker side of our relationship, which is the gun dealing and the drug cartels, and that was somewhat kept apart in the past. So hopefully we will segment those things and focus on the productive side, because in the end, it's the economy. And if we find joint profit possibilities together, that's what eventually will drive out the weed and the bad things. But if we focus mostly on the drug cartels, we're going to be saying nasty things to each other, and we won't be able to have a constructive relationship. So hopefully the business community stands up and says, "Hey guys, just don't mess with this, because it's beneficial to both of us."
Yeah, I have. That made me think of one other question. Sorry, Raul,
Oh.
okay. There might be a difference here between Mexican society's response as opposed to the Mexican government's response. There have been talks, both in the previous Trump administration and now, as part of the campaign, that part of the strategy of the U.S. government would be to basically treat cartels as terrorist organizations and begin, maybe droning the cartels. Um, uh, what do you think that would create? If do you think the Mexican government would consent to the U.S. doing that? And how would Mexican society respond to one or two things? One is the Mexican government consenting to the U.S. allowing military operations against the cartels in Mexico. So how would the Mexican people think if the government consented to that? And second part of the question is, if the U.S. did it without the Mexican government's consent, what do you think the Mexican people's response would be if the U.S. government had military interventions against the cartels, without the consent of the Mexican government? So, what do you think Mexican society's response under those two scenarios?
Well, if I mean, if you have that's the problem of mixing the trade and the cartels in the same table, because then you can't have a meaningful conversation, and it's a problem that can't be solved by beheading the cartels. I mean, because it's not that it's just a couple of groups. That it's a system that's working, and if you don't stop the demand of the product, or you don't legalize the demand of the product, then it's impossible to finish that market. No, so you're just fighting something that will keep coming on at you, and it's corrupting, and it can go all the way up. You don't know where all those links with the cartels that have a lot of money, where do those links end? So it would be a never-ending story. So hopefully we can segment the conversation. If we can't do that, then it's going to be very messy.
Do you think I want to ask one other when your answers provoke other questions? So sorry. Now the cartels are very sophisticated organizations, and I've read a lot that the cartels, Mexican cartels, have a knowledge exchange with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. So as we notice, Israel's problems of eliminating Hamas in Gaza has basically caused a lot of innocent people deaths without really even accomplishing that objective almost everybody from Hezbollah and Hamas has been killed as far as the leadership, but the organization still continue to exist and continue to be an obstacle. And because the organizations, as you've already pointed out, are more than just the heads, these are basically fairly decentralized organizations. And I think people underestimate how decentralized, these organizations are. And that's what makes them robust, because they have to specialize in knowing how to be anti-fragile with respect to government intervention. So if they're centralized, they're fragile, and these people are experts in not being fragile, and and they've been able to develop and evolve this expertise over a long period of time of how to figure out how to be anti-fragile with respect to the government. So, how much would be your concern that in going after the cartels, you'd see the type of, and I hate to describe it as collateral damage because it's much worse than collateral damage, but to see that type amount of civilian, can you really do anything meaningful to the cartels through droning? And if it requires so to do anything meaningful, it might
No.
require the type of action Israel is attempting to do in Gaza, which clearly is failing. So,
I guess the best thing would be to try to legalize as much as possible and control. So if you put it on the light, and then you have visibility of the economic flows that are associated with these drugs, and then you allow the doctors to prescribe them, so the people who need to consume because they are addicts, they can slowly get out of their addiction and have make it part of the economy, then you can control it. But if what's happening now is what happened in the prohibition in the United States. No, and you have all these Chicago-style stories, and the thing that ended it was to eliminate the prohibition. So if we don't move into something like that, it's going to be very difficult to stop it.
Well, thank you. I'll leave it there. For all those that's a great concluding statement. And I want to thank you very much for your participation in this conversation. I think it was I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's really nice always talking with you. Thank you for inviting
Well,
me.
you have a great day. You have a great day, and thank you so much, Raul. I look forward to seeing you soon again.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.